Just want to welcome everyone to opening day of the Silurians 2016-17 season. My name is Bernard Kirsch, and I'm the new president of the Silurians. I'm extremely happy to see this incredible turnout for our first luncheon. I think I can attribute this large crowd to one of two possible reasons. You're all here to welcome me on my first appearance as president. Okay, keep laughing, go ahead. Or you're here to welcome our opening day speaker, Frank Bruni. But before we move on, I want to give heartfelt thanks to our past president, Betsy Ashton, who left the Silurians in fine financial and mental health. Betsy is now working on a book, My 3 Annulments and Other Thoughts of Love and Life, and someday she may be our next speaker. She will be a tough act to follow. For this coming year, much will be the same as last year, except our lunches will be $5 more than last season. All our meetings will continue to be held on the 3rd Wednesday of the month, and I am extremely happy that we are back at the National Arts Club. We will be here for all 8 lunches and 2 dinners, including 1 dinner honoring one of our own, Betsy Wade. Since our June lunch, we have added 3 new members, which brings our total to 307. Those members are Sally Olds, an award-winning writer who specializes in child development, family life, human relationships, and health. She has written for too many publications to mention. Also, Tony Mancini, who is a reporter and editor at the New York Post and is now director of the Brooklyn College journalism program. The third new member is Suzanne Charlet, who is a contract writer at the New York Times Magazine, later became the assignment editor at the magazine, and someone I haven't seen in about 20, 30 years. Welcome, Suzanne. Unfortunately, we've had 1 death. Marty Hollander of Newsday, who for 25 years, who worked at the Wall Street Journal, the Philadelphia Bulletin, and ended his career at Newsday. So if we could have a moment of silence for Marty. First of all, I'm extremely happy that our first guest during my reign as president is the New York Times columnist Frank Bruni. For me, what makes a columnist special is if I agree with what he is writing. And so for me, Frank is special. When I read what he has written in the Times, I say to myself, gee, I wish I could have written that. For instance, in the closing graph of his column, The Trouble for Hillary, Frank writes, yes, love trumps hate, but the hateful currents running through America are powerful ones, and they're born of a disillusionment that she, Hillary, minimizes at her peril. And Frank, on Donald Trump's ideology of applause, I love this one. For Trump, the whole point of political office is adulation, and adulation is proof of a person's entire worth. Rectitude pales next to ratings. Ethics are a sorry substitute for applause, and the methods by which a crowd is fired up don't matter, so long as he can bask in the clapping. And then, of course, there are Frank's tweets. My dog-walking neighbor just showed me his new poop bags from online. They bear Trump's visage. Who says American innovation is dead? Well, although his hair refuses to accept it, Donald Trump is 70 years old. And finally, Clinton's health may not be ideal, but Trump's no Hercules, more like Nero, with sycophants paling his grapes. And now I would like Frank to quote Frank.
Thank you. Thank you, Bernie, very much. Thanks for having me here. I'm not going to speechify for very long because I'd really rather chat with you all and answer whatever questions you have about any number of things. And I say any number of things because, as I was reminded at the table, I was asked to say a little bit about my kind of unorthodox journalism career. And it has been very unorthodox in the sense that over the last 30 years, I've been a movie critic. I've been a restaurant critic. Mimi Sheridan is here at the table. It's great to see her. I have covered the Vatican for the Times. I've covered a presidential campaign. My little brother always says to me, I don't have a career, I have an attention deficit disorder, which is totally, totally true. And in fact, seeing Mimi, I'm reminded of so many things. It's weird, to this day, it's very weird for me to come up to a microphone and kind of face you all and speak, because even though it was only a tiny segment of my career, the 5.5 years that I was restaurant critic were very large ones for me. I'm sure they were very large for you, Mimi, and partly it's because you are told all the time to be very, very careful about your physical identity and not to let your picture be taken, not to come stand at an event like this and talk out in the open, because restaurateurs are not supposed to recognize you. Of course, the great myth is that they don't recognize you, because they do all the time. And the dirty secret is when they do recognize you, your evening does become different from that of an average diner. And whenever people ask me how, I think always, I'm sorry, I'm having a little bit of a Hillary Clinton moment here with my coughing. I used to call it, when I needed water, I used to call it a Marco Rubio moment, but now it's a Hillary Clinton moment, I guess. I always think of a meal I had, one of my last meals at Nobu 57, which opened on my watch. And over the course of the whole meal, I and my companions, the three of us, had one server who was clearly dealing with no table but ours. And when she wasn't actually bringing us something or clearing a plate, she was standing just a few feet away, and apparently she was eavesdropping, because at the end of the meal, I went to the men's room, I was washing my hands, I hit the soap dispenser really hard, and a blob of soap spat out and hit my shirt and made a sort of wet stain. And it looked silly, and when I got back to the table, I said to my companions, I'm sorry I looked like this, but I hit the soap dispenser really hard, and that's what happened to my shirt. A couple moments later, the check came. The server delivered the check, and she bent over, and she whispered to me, sir, I want to apologize. I want to let you know that we've taken several glasses of wine off your bill as our apology for the malfunction of our soap dispenser. And I said, I thought about arguing with her because, you don't want to take anything for free. God forbid you should be corruptible. But this was like a this was a sushi restaurant, right? So this was like a $950 bill, and I thought nobody's going to say I was bought off by 2 glasses of white wine, and I'll just leave a big tip. So that's what we did. We got it from the table. This very, very neatly dressed man rushes towards us, stops at me and says, sir, I'm the manager of the restaurant. And I just want to tell you how sorry we are about the malfunction of our soap dispenser. And I told him what I told the server. I'd already said to the server, listen, your soap dispenser's fine. I am a known lifelong klutz. This is all on me. It's really not a big deal. And he says to me, well, be that as it may. He hands me his card, and he says, if you need to get the shirt replaced or dry cleaned, please be in touch with us. And it was at this point that I felt the need to point out something obvious. I said, I think the stain's going to come out. It's soap. And then the restaurant, totally showing its vanity, he said, yes, and it is Kiehl's. So, as I said, it's weird to kind of be in public in a way that I wasn't allowed to be then. I was asked to talk just a teeny bit about how my journalistic path, which has been such a swerving one. I didn't grow up knowing I wanted to be a writer or a journalist, but in high school, one of my extracurriculars was the school newspaper. Another one was the school literary magazine. I got to college. I went to the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. I really started working on the student newspaper there, less as a kind of gesture of professional ambition than just as that was the place I hung out. That's where my friends were. I never took a journalism class at the University of North Carolina, although they did have a journalism school, because I wanted to read great books and take history classes, and I thought I really wanted to get a classic liberal arts education. Many of the people I worked with at the school newspaper, though, were taking journalism classes, and that was a very professional environment. And by the time I graduated, I realized I hadn't figured out anything else to do. And I thought, well, people do this for a living. They do make careers out of this. And so I just began doing journalism job after journalism job. One of my first jobs was with the New York Post. 2 of my colleagues there are here today. Hello, Myron and Pete. And I was there for a year and a half. I went from there to the Detroit Free Press, where I worked for 5 years. And while I was at the Free Press, I wrote what was then, and I think to date, the longest story that they'd ever published, and it was quite a brave thing that they did. It was a narrative profile of a convicted child molester who was in prison, and it was the story of his quote-unquote relationship with the 10 and then 11 and then 12 and then 13-year-old boy across the street, how they had been involved for so many years, how his own family had missed it and then not missed it and said nothing, how the boy's parents across the street had sort of had it all there in front of their eyes and had chosen to look away. And it was sort of an emblematic story of one of the problems with fighting child sexual abuse. And the Detroit Free Press, to its incredible credit and courage, was so convinced of the merit of the story that not only did they give me several months to work on it every week, I would travel 3 hours across the state to the prison where the child molester was serving a sentence, and we would sit for 3 hours, record it all, transcribe it. As I said, it became the longest story the Detroit Free Press had ever published. The New York Times saw it. It was a finalist for a Pulitzer, and they got in touch with me because I was at that point a 28-year-old who was a Pulitzer finalist. It being the New York Times, I was hired 2.5 years later. But I remember when they finally did bring me in for an interview, they said to me at the time, we hire people, this sounds a little pompous, but we all know the Times can be a little pompous, right? And they said, we don't hire people for jobs, we hire them for careers. And I thought that was just a line, but I have been so grateful and lucky at the New York Times because they did hire me for a career and not for a job. And at every step of the way, when they were curious to see what I would do in a new job, they gave me the opportunity to do that job. So I covered a presidential campaign. I covered the first 7-8 months of the Bush White House. Then I was in Rome covering the Vatican and Italy and Greece. Then they brought me back here to be the restaurant critic for 5.5 years. And then shortly after that, they made me an op-ed columnist, which has been a wonderful, lovely gesture of faith on their part. And I feel incredibly, incredibly blessed to have been the recipient of that. I was also asked to just say a few words about the current presidential election, which I think we can all agree is not like any presidential election campaign we've seen in our lifetimes. I know, does anyone have a weirder one to nominate? No? Anyone think of a stranger major party nominee than Donald Trump? Okay, no hands, yeah. I was having lunch earlier this week. Actually, I'm sorry, it was late last week, with a woman named Beth Myers, who was Mitt Romney's chief of staff when he was governor of Massachusetts, and has since been the sort of like constant uppermost senior advisor in his various political bids and that sort of thing. Lovely, lovely, lovely person, Beth Myers, and she's become a good friend. And it's a friendship I value in part because I'm pro-choice, she's pro-life. We're not on the same side on a lot of issues, but we both respect that we're earnest people who come by what we believe in a heartfelt fashion. She is not someone who's supporting Donald Trump. She's in that robust group of Republicans who, to varying degrees of publicness, have said, no, I'm not going to vote for Trump. I think he'd be a danger to the country. She was asking me, like, what is going to be the larger lesson? What's the larger takeaway of this election? And I don't think that's ever an answerable question until we get some distance on it. But I think one of the things that we're not pulling back enough to see clearly is just what this says about the degree of pessimism in America right now. What this says about the way in which this country has turned a kind of corner from a land that was always synonymous with optimism and the endless frontier and tomorrow always being richer and brighter than yesterday. I think we've moved past that in this country in a way that demands a lot of reflection. It is the case that since the early 70s, several times a year, NBC News and the Wall Street Journal in their poll asked, do you think the country's on the right track or the wrong track? That's a question a lot of different polls ask, but different polls get different results. Since 2004, for the last 12 years, every time that question is asked in this poll, more Americans say the country is on the wrong track than say that it is on the right track. There's no period in the history of that polling question that comes anywhere close to that 12 sustained years of fundamental pessimism in the country. It used to be the case that when you asked another frequently asked poll question, do you think your children will have better lives than you have? It used to be a kind of article of faith that, except very, very minor exceptions, little windows of time, a significant, clear majority of Americans would say, yes, I expect my children to have better lives than I do. That answer has been the opposite way. Significant majorities for many years now have said, no, I don't expect my children to have a better life than I do. That's another fundamental change in the country. The last time I looked at the right track, wrong track number, I think wrong track was in the 70s and right track was in the high teens. And it's really important to remember that when we're trying to figure out why Americans dislike these two candidates so much, why Donald Trump has been able to mount such a successful campaign from such an unconventional background and with such unconventional methods. People in this country feel very uncertain and very gloomy, and they're almost willing to kind of wager it all on an experiment, to throw up the pieces just to see where they're going to land. And that's an important component of this election. Another thing that I think we're seeing in this race, in other races in general, that I think we haven't quite reckoned with, is just how fractured we've become as a result, in part, of the rise of social media. The whole temperature of Donald Trump's political bid, I mean, the temperature of his words, it's all tied in to a 140-character universe of kind of expletives and staccato communication. And when you have people who can't understand each other at all, it's in large part because the way we consume media these days, and I say this to you because we're all people who are in or have been in or care about the media, it's utterly, utterly different. The general interest newspaper is almost dead. The general interest newscast, is a thing for the history books. Nowadays, you can curate your news consumption in a manner so that you are constantly just hearing and thinking about the few things that you most like to hear or think about, and you are just getting your own beliefs reflected back at you. I do a lot of visits to college campuses, and one of the scariest things for me is when I ask young men and women in college how they get their information, and it's all from the people they follow on Facebook, the people they follow on Twitter. And when you ask them to pause and ask if those people are sharing links that represent anything like a diverse diet of information, only then do they realize no, but they're really not that concerned, because what they like about their news consumption, about their news universe, is that they are constantly interacting with like-minded people. There's no way to understand other people if it's like that. And when we look at the sclerosis of Congress, when we look at the degree of polarization in our country, at the animus that exists across party lines, this is making it worse and has a lot to do with it. One of the scariest bits of information I think I've tripped across in recent years was back in 1960, when they asked people, when they asked Democrats and they asked Republicans, if your son or daughter, how would you be upset if your son or daughter married someone of the other political persuasion? The answer back in the 1960s was like about 5% of Democrats and 5% of Republicans said they'd be upset. One presumes most of the other 95% laughed at the idea that that would be such an upsetting thing. When they asked that question in 2010, 50 years later, it was 40% of Republicans and 36% of Democrats said they would be genuinely upset if their child married someone across the party divide. That says a lot about what's happened. We need to turn down the temperature of the discourse, of the way we talk about people who are on the other side of the political divide, people who don't believe what we believe. I was at a breakfast event, totally unrelated to this kind of thing this morning, speaking about college of all things. And right beforehand, a man walked up to me and was talking about the election, asked me if I thought there was any chance Donald Trump would win. He was an ardent Trump opponent. I said, yes, there's a chance. It's not how I would bet my money, but of course there's a chance. And I said, there's especially a better chance if Hillary Clinton keeps on making mistakes that are unnecessary, like her basket of deplorables. And he said, well, I was actually at that fundraiser. And I said, oh, okay. And he said, I loved that she said that. I said, well, okay, why'd you love that she said it? And he said, well, because it's true. And I said, she just labeled 20% of Americans. If you kind of do the math on this, some people say 25%, it's really more like 20%. She just labeled them deplorable, and you're good with that. And he said, well, I think they are deplorable. And I said, all of them? He said, yes. I said, why are they deplorable? He said, well, they're racist, they're homophobic. And I said, well, let's stop at the homophobic. I said, we've got a real problem in this country when in 2012, the beginning of 2012, our president still had not come out in support of same-sex marriage. Hillary Clinton trailed him. It's 4 years later, and suddenly you are a horrible human being if you are not right with the program. We have to think about what sort of flexibility, open-mindedness, tolerance that shows. And I think we need to worry a little bit, especially those of us who might be characterized as being a little bit to the left, at the way we look at and talk to people who aren't totally with the program, because sometimes society has changed pretty damn quickly on them. And to simply label them unenlightened, deplorable, and unworthy of our conversation is not going to get us anywhere. That's longer than I meant to blather on, but I'd love to talk more about the election. We can talk more about restaurants. We can talk about, I have a meatloaf book coming out in February. So I guess I'm supposed to the attention deficit disorder point, my last book was on college admissions. The book before that was a memoir. The book before that was a sort of biography of George W. Bush. And the next book is called A Meatloaf in Every Oven. So we can talk about meatloaf. Anyway, please, questions?
Hi, Lida Snow.
Hi.
Hi. Can you address the worldwide growth of a white nationalist movement that seems also to be here in America? Can you talk about that?
I can't say anything about it that I don't think other people have said much better. I think people react to change sometimes in a way. They react to a diversifying world. They react to a world with more porous boundaries in a way that often makes them want to pull ever tighter into kind of narrow identity groups. I think we all made, and this is a big lesson of Brexit, I think we all made the assumption that what we sometimes call globalization or globalism, whatever, is a good thing that everyone would welcome. People derive a whole lot of their identities from their tribes. And when you, I think the great challenge of civilization in a certain way is balancing an understanding that people need certain things from the tribes they're in. They need to dwell in certain tribes to an extent to kind of get the feeling of security and identity, to push back at that enough that we don't have the worst fruits of tribalism, but not to ignore it to the point where we end up triggering a reaction. And I think what you see in the people who voted to leave the European Union, what you see in more exaggerated forms in terms of some of the movements that you've made reference to, are people who kind of feel so forced away from what has normally been their kind of point of identity, that they're overreacting in the opposite way. I mean, that's something I noticed, but there's a lot more going into it. A lot of these movements are happening in places that are gripped by the kind of economic pessimism that we're gripped by, and you're looking for points of consolation when you feel powerless, when you feel like you have less agency than you did in the past. Often you want to find something else that makes you feel stronger or superior. And buying into some sort of hierarchy where you are more of a person than someone else can do that. It can afford you, it can reconnect you with the pride that you've lost in other facets of life. I think all of that's going on. First of all, I think there are huge gradations here. Like when you're talking about deplorables or whatever, I mean, there are people who are inveterate, disgusting racists, and they're hopeless, but I don't think it's 20% of Americans. I mean, maybe I'm just cheerier about this than you. I just don't think it's a constructive way to talk. Like, what's the goal? The goal is presumably to move people away from those sorts of sentiments. And I don't think shouting at them about how deplorable and horrible they are is going to accomplish that at all. And I think, yeah, I mean, that's really what I'm saying. But I also think in some of their cases, it's not hideous. There are various kinds of people, and I think some of them we need to try to understand. The change happens at a certain kind of pace. It's why I brought up the same-sex marriage thing. When in 2012, your president and your soon-to-be Democratic nominee are still not saying they believe in that or are for that, and in 2016 it becomes the position that everybody, even a 68-year-old in an evangelical community in the South, is supposed to have gotten with the program, that's not a realistic understanding of human nature, and it's not very humane to paint that person as a total villain without trying to understand that the world has changed very, very rapidly for that person, and maybe that person needs a breath to catch up.
Frank, as you know, some countries limit the amount of time where you can start advertising for elections. Are we in a new paradigm here for the future with social media? In other words, are all the elections now, you think, going to be this kind of pounding of constant daily kinds of activity going on? Or is this just a one-off kind of election, do you think?
No, I think I think we've been traveling, this is a trend line that's been going on for a while. I mean, this election is just an amplification of the last one, which is an amplification. I mean, this trend line has only gone in one direction. I mean, I think a lot of Americans will and do turn it off. because it gets so loud and so chaotic. And a lot of us who tune into it, I think we overestimate how many people are paying attention and are hearing and seeing all the things that we are. I was talking just the other day on the telephone with the former senator, former Governor Bob Kerrey, because I was writing something for the weekend about the debates, the first debate, and what it will mean, might mean, could mean. And I wanted to talk to some people smarter than myself, and Bob Kerrey's a frequent dinner companion and a man I respect and value his intelligence a lot. And he was saying he thought the first debate would matter, a big deal. And I said, why? And he said, because of the undecideds. And we were talking about how can you, in this election, be undecided? You know, I mean, in terms of the very media saturation you're talking about, in terms of the largeness and the duration in the public eye of both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, you not only have the two least liked pair of nominees in modern political history, you also have the two best known by far. And those two things, by the way, may be related. There are nonetheless Americans who pay so little attention that when they tune into the debate Monday night, they're sort of seeing these two, not for the first time, but with open eyes and a sort of blank slate that's nothing like probably anybody in this room. And we forget that. And he was making the point that in a weird way, the mere fact of the debate is going to do a lot of good for Donald Trump because he's going to be standing, as he did in Mexico with the head of state there, he's going to be standing on a stage with someone who no one has trouble imagining being president. And that kind of, immediately makes him someone who has a similar stature by dint of being in the same space. And if he can restrain himself and appear presidential, whatever that's supposed to mean, to people who haven't been noticing everything that preceded it, he may actually derive much more benefit from that evening than one who's been paying close attention would assume he could. But no, I think this is just going in one direction, and the only changes will be how many people tune in and how many people tune out. And it could be that more and more people tune out because it just gets so loud and chaotic for those who are trying to tune in that it becomes repulsive.
Why do you think Hillary is disliked by so many people?
Why is Hillary Clinton disliked by so many people? I think there's no one answer. There's no one answer to that. I think for some people, sexism is a part of it, but I think sexism is too easy an answer because I think it's just a part of it. I mean, I think different people dislike her for different reasons, and then you add it all together. I think it is very hard to be a person in public life as long as she has, and even more so to be a woman in public life as long as she has, and not to have done a number of things, whether you deserve to have the reaction or not, whether they were intentional or not, that alienate people over time. I also think she has been very ill-served by her own protective, verging on paranoiac impulses. She has never, almost every couple of years, you read a story about how Hillary Clinton is about to rethink her relationship with the media and start kind of letting them in as never before. Because it hasn't worked the other way around. That never, ever happens, right? And if you have a terrible relationship with the news media, and that's the product of never having trusted them, why would you continue to distrust them? I mean, you're not, if you don't change the behavior, how's the reaction ever going to change? So I think that's a part of it. It was a darker interpretation than I buy into, but there was a very fascinating column in the Wall Street Journal a couple days ago, I think, by Peggy Noonan, just recounting Travelgate from the early days of the Clinton administration. And she framed it in exactly the right way, which is look at the way this scandal, or whatever you want to call it, unfolded. Look at the way the Clintons in general, and Hillary Clinton in particular, reacted. And tell me you don't see that happening again and again through the years, and tell me how that's a winning public relations strategy. It's not a winning public relations strategy. Finally, we are such a politically polarized country that when you show me someone who's got negatives of, say, 62, well, 45% of those negatives are practically baked in by the fact that there are people on the other party who don't like anybody across the aisle. And so you get to those high numbers because you're starting from a foundation or a baseline that's pretty damn high just as a result of partisan politics.
At your own next step.
Oh, I have no clue. I mean, I wouldn't be shocked if in 5 years I was writing about football because I'm a big football fan. I wouldn't be shocked if I'm on the soup line because this is journalism in 2016. So I take it column by column.
Hi, Kate McLeod. You talked about the fracturing of this country based on social media and 140 characters. What part of this fracturing has to do with economics?
Well, a lot of it it's a really interesting question. A lot of it does have to do with the economics of the news business. I mean, this isn't, I think, what you're asking, but since we're talking about kind of how people get their information, it is extremely expensive to gather fresh news. To do the it's extremely expensive to have a Baghdad bureau if you're the New York Times. It's extremely expensive to have reporters all over the country actually kind of going out and reporting developing news. It is extremely inexpensive to found a website of people doing what I admit I now do for a living and riffing off of the information that other people are getting. And so if you look at where where there's been growth in news organizations being defined not just as things that come out on paper, but as websites and such, the growth has almost entirely been among news organizations, outlets, whatever you want to call them, that wear a certain ideological hat and that peddle a certain sort of ideological slant. That's their business plan. That's their. It means that when people are constructing the kind of news diet I was talking about before, they can have 10 things bookmarked. They can be following on Twitter 30 different journalists. They can believe that that means they are collecting a lot of information, but everything they're doing is really right along the same color band of the spectrum. And that has a lot to do with the economics of the news business.
Hi, Frank.
Hi, Myron.
I think you know what I'm going to ask you.
You can ask it anyway.
I know. Years ago, at one of your book events at Barnes & Noble, I attended.
Thank you for coming to the book event.
And I asked the former New York Times restaurant reviewer if he was a good cook. And you confessed that you had started a kitchen fire.
I've never been a good cook, or a particularly good cook. I think I'm a good cook now. I've never been a great cook. I was a much worse cook then, and what Myron is remembering, and I'd forgotten it until he mentioned to me when I walked in the room, was an Oscar party that I had at my place in Georgetown when I was stationed in Washington, D.C. for the Times. And I was trying to make mashed potatoes. And I had failed to take the butter out with any sort of advance period, and it was hard as a rock. And in my in my spastic attempt to answer the door, pour people drinks, get dinner ushered along further, I think I was making a meatloaf that night, in fact. I realized I was not going to be able to combine this butter with the potatoes unless I softened it a little bit, and I don't know what I was thinking, but the microwave was in use for something else. So I simply put 2 sticks of butter sort of open a little bit in the oven with the meatloaf, and completely forgot they were there until one of my guests said, "Frank, there's a fire in your kitchen." And there were just flames coming out of the stove. And I remember literally getting a bucket of water and throwing it into the stove, which is apparently the wrong thing to do. I think everything I did was wrong that night. My guests ate a meatloaf that was below rare because the oven shorted. And I've gotten better since then, though. I did a lot of meatloaf cookery over the last couple of years for the cookbook, and so I feel much more comfortable in the kitchen. And I haven't had any fires since. Okay.
Hi, I'd like to ask you about your writing process. Your writing is so vivid and so thoughtful, and I'd like to ask, is writing easy for you, or do you agonize over what you're writing? And how do you find columns, topics for columns? Do you always have a pile of columns on the side that you can do? I mean, I'd like to know how you do this.
Thanks for the kind words, for starters. I don't, sometimes I find writing really easy, and sometimes I would rather have someone pull out my toenails one at a time, And the weird thing is, and I mean, many people in this room have written their whole lives, maybe I'd be curious if other people have the same. I keep on waiting for when I will have done it long enough that it's always easy, and I now realize that's never going to be the case. And the frustrating thing for me, but I think this is true of most people, is you can't guess going into a given week, going into a given column, whether this is one that's going to come out really easily. I mean, who knows? Maybe it's based on what you had for lunch or whether you took a run or not. It seems that fickle and alchemical, But sometimes it comes out really easily. Sometimes I'm shocked at how I'm struggling. And there is and I've never discovered any secret other than I do think that when you're struggling, walking away from the computer, taking a run, doing something completely, or reading. Often what I'm missing is some sort of kind of internal rhythm voice that if I just step aside and read like a chapter of a novel or a long magazine cover story, I go back to the computer and I find for some reason it's like the wiring has gotten back to a better place. I think I speak for most columnists when I say like I kind of have a computer file of things I think would be interesting to write, of headlines that signify like the topic or even of a first sentence. But what you find is when a given week comes along, sometimes none of those make sense. Sometimes there's something in the news that you think, no, I really want to write about this. And so some of those things stay in that file untouched for a long time, and some of them stay there for a long time untouched, and then you look there and you realize, oh, for some reason this is the perfect week for that, and that didn't grow old, or that in fact got more relevant because of something that happened, and you dip into it. So I think it's a combination of having a storehouse of fallback ideas with just kind of looking up every day and saying, is there anything right now that I should write, that's fresh, that's just coming to me.
Frank, Mike Eisgrau, you've been using words like fracturing and a disparate sense of people. Is the genie out of the bottle, and is there any way to get it back?
Wow, yeah, I mean, I don't know if there's a way to get it back. I think it involves being conscious enough of it that we have a generation of parents who make decisions about their children's lives that are decisions to make sure those children swim in diverse seas, not ethnically, racially, ideologically, politically, and don't get cocooned, siloed, into just one small community. Because right now, almost any way you slice it, we're physically living in a more segregated, economically segregated way than ever before. I know more and more people of certain means sending their kids to private schools, and they're not sending them there to take them away from a more diverse environment, but that's one of the effects of it, and they're not realizing that is, or they're not fully kind of appreciating and adjusting to what that reality is. I think if we can all come to understand how imperiled our country is by all of these people across racial lines, across economic lines, across political lines, not having any familiarity with one another, and then not being able to talk to one another, we can make decisions about the way we live, about the way we travel, about the schools we attend, that push back against that, but we have to define it as a value that we're concerned about. And I'm not sure that has happened enough. It is happening. There's a whole, in a small way, there's a whole genre of literature that's sort of devoted to this, whether it's, Bowling Alone, Coming Apart, The Vanishing Neighbor. Like I have a list at home of the books that have been written that are the document of just how tracked and siloed and cocooned our lives are becoming. Maybe if we decide that's not okay and we make it a value to push back against that, there's some hope for us, because you can make all sorts of decisions about where you go to college, about where you end up buying a home, about the schools you put your kids into, about what you read, about those bookmarks that you assemble on your computer. You can make decisions to be the other way. You just have to be conscious of the fact that you're not that way, and of the fact that there's a long-term important civic value in doing it in a more diverse, integrated, et cetera way.
This way. Hi, Betsy Ashton. I was going to ask exactly the same question, but following up on it, Bowling Alone, it's interesting because what he said in that wonderful book was that the world came together every time we had a war, and then we all had to deal with it, and we all had to sacrifice and such, and I hope it doesn't come to that to bring us back together again. But in this splintering
is this not also an indictment of the educational system? In the sense that I remember it was 12th grade English class, in my case, public school, where we learned critical thinking. We were taught all of the different techniques of propaganda, stacking the deck, and all of this kind of thing. I don't know that the kids are taught that anymore.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that something is totally lost when people don't understand how to look at an ad and whatever else and listen to what is
Or even that
essentially...
it is an ad.
Yeah,
Right?
exactly,
Yeah.
and figure it out.
Yeah. No, yeah, I don't know enough about the curriculum right now, but that could well be the case. I do think you're right, whether it's a failure in specific of school curriculum in the educational system. I do think that people don't recognize propaganda as readily as they did in the past. But I think it's partly because they have such a monochromatic consumption habit that why would you see something as propaganda if everything you're seeing falls into that exact same viewpoint and category, right? Hey, how are you?
Hey, I'm Leslie Hutchings.
Hi.
I have read things and heard things that the hope of this country lies with the millennials and that they will be the next greatest generation. What do you think about that?
Hope it's true. I mean, I've read a lot of things about the millennials. I've read that. I've also read that they're, as a group and as, broad brush generalizing, very entitled, and I've seen that in cases. So I don't know what to expect or make totally of millennials right now. I think some of what you've read, which appears to be true, is that they are a little bit more engaged in and ripe for volunteerism than some other generations have been. One of the things that I find interesting when I interact with them, I'm as some of my remarks betrayed, I'm sort of very intrigued by this notion of how economically pessimistic Americans have come. How this belief that we can constantly grow the pie and have a bigger, better tomorrow has sort of vanished. And one of the reasons I think we have some of the politics we do, and this sort of strikes to the question you asked about economics and fracturing, is I think people feel like they're competing for a finite pot, for pieces of a finite pie, rather than a pie that can grow. And so it's sort of a zero-sum game to a lot of them. I sometimes ask millennials, do you feel that you are going to live when you're fully into adulthood, or when you're in your 50s, 60s, whatever, do you feel you're going to live in an America that's richer than the America of today? And an answer I frequently get, which is really interesting, which I think speaks to what you've read, is no, but I think I'm going to live in a fairer America, which is I think, a very reassuring answer, because A, it's a reminder that it's a whole lot more out there than acquisitiveness and money and the size of the GDP. But I think it also means that partly because they've grown up in an era and in the midst of a conversation about economic limits, they are placing their values on other things, and they're looking at life through a lens that's larger than just how big will my house be? Will I have 2 cars or 1 in the garage? Will it be a Jaguar or will it be a Buick? And they're looking at issues of social justice and fairness and inclusiveness that I think make them an interesting generation, and one that one can feel a lot of hope about. That I've noticed.
I think if we took a vote in this room, Hillary would win overwhelmingly. But many people in this room are getting worried. The race seems to be tightening, particularly in some of the pivotal states. What's your view?
My view is, if I had to make a prediction today, if I had to bet money, I would absolutely bet it on her. I think if you look at the state polls, and you look at the Electoral College, she absolutely has the advantage. And a lot of those overlap with, those reflect the demographic advantage in presidential elections that Democrats have in general. But do I feel secure and safe as someone who believes she's the right choice? Do I feel safe and secure that I will wake up on November 9th and be talking about President Clinton? No. Because I don't think she has successfully sold herself to the American people. And I think we're living in a moment right now of such disenchantment, of such disgust with traditional institutions and the status quo, that there are a lot of people who can't bring themselves to vote for her because she feels so much like yesterday. It's one of those, it's the kind of transcendent irony of her candidacy, is she would be breaking a barrier. She'd be the first woman president ever, and yet I'm not sure we've had a presidential campaign who feels so much like yesterday. And she's battling that every day, because this is an election when my read of the American public, despite the 5% or 6% unemployment rate, my read of the American public, based on right track, wrong numbers, is people would like a big change. And it's very hard for a lot of Americans to vote for Hillary if what you really want is a big change. I think Donald Trump has so shot himself in the foot so many times that he may have nullified what should be, at this point, now that he has the nomination, a great advantage, which is he's the only one of the two who can really claim credibly to be a change agent. But I think he's lost all credibility with most even-keeled, sane voters.
How would you advise Hillary to defeat Trump because of his disruptive methods in debate?
Well, I think my main advice to her for the debate and for the rest of the campaign would be to stop worrying so much about making the case against Donald Trump, and to I mean, granted, a lot of people are tuned out, and this isn't entirely or maybe even chiefly on her campaign, but I think there are a lot of people who, if you said to them, what's the 1-sentence, 2-sentence, 3-sentence case for Hillary Clinton's candidacy, or what is boiled down her vision and argument, they wouldn't be able to answer the question. So the slogan I've heard most frequently recently for Hillary Clinton and Tim Kaine is stronger together, right? That's a defensive slogan because that's a reaction to the divisiveness that they are, I think, rightly accusing Donald Trump of. I think there are so many people out there in the media, in her party, even in the Republican Party, who are daily and hourly making the case against Donald Trump and bemoaning and bringing to light, what reckless things he has said and done, that I think she would serve herself better by talking about why her as opposed to why not him. And that, I think, is something that if she spends the debate talking about why not him, I think she has squandered an opportunity.
Possibly. What do you think will happen if Trump wins? Or what do you think may be the worst, or some of the worst things that might happen?
I have no idea. I have no idea. I think, I can only speak in generalities. I think we would lose a lot of respect on the world stage, and I don't think that's a small thing. I think really there would be a totally different view of America out there among people who have watched this campaign and would wonder what it says about a country, that he could be forgiven all the things that you'd have to forgive him for to be elected. I think the degree to which many Americans of Hispanic descent, many African Americans, will have felt like the country just slapped them in the face, that worries me. So I feel like there would be a kind of tension that would be much greater than, say, if Hillary was elected. Those are two general things I worry about, but I can't tell you, we're going to be at war, or we're going to, I don't know. And, I will say this, Donald Trump could be elected and he could surprise us. I don't see, I don't believe that's going to happen. I'm not saying, hey, don't worry, it could all be great, but let's just accentuate the positive, and here's the real truth. The problem is whichever one of them is elected, and you may find this consoling if what you're imagining is a Trump election, and you may find it dispiriting if you're imagining a Clinton election. Whoever is elected is not going to be able to do nearly as much as he or she would like to do, or as we would like that person to do if we're on their side, or as should be done, because they're not going to be working with a Congress that's a theater of cooperation. We're all sitting here. It's been, Barack Obama was elected in 2008. We've been talking about the need for big infrastructure spending, at least since then. And this should not even be a partisan issue. Children and by the time, if we ever break this political gridlock and get around to building the things that need to be built and that were built 40 years ago, enabling us to have the level of affluence in the country we have now, we are already so far behind countries that are not as politically gridlocked as our own, that we're going to have a hard time catching up. And I would like to think that simply electing the right president was going to be the magic thing that was going to enable us to tackle all of those things that shouldn't be partisan and that we all know need doing. But my true sense is the election will happen, whoever's elected, a month later, everyone's going to be talking about 2020. Everyone's going to be maneuvering and grandstanding for 2020, and Congress is going to be locked in war with whichever president it is, and we're just going to and we're going to be talking not about all the horrible things that were done, but we're going to be talking about all the things that are not being done, and the kind of sense of just total drift and paralysis. Sure, thanks for.
Just before Frank leaves, I just want to mention that he's now an honorary Silurian. Thank you, Frank.
Thank you.
And so we will see everyone on October 19th when Jeffrey Toobin will be our speaker.